You can't charge for outgoing references anymore. So I don't know if any of you do, but a lot of agents actually charge a tenant to provide them with a reference if they're looking to move on. That can't happen anymore. But the good news is there are some payments that tenants still can make. Now, in the first draft of the tenant fee ban, they actually missed out rent as a permitted payment. Can you believe it? The tenants were not permitted to pay rent. Thankfully, they've changed that, and in the final guidance, they are now permitted to pay you rent. So rent is an allowable payment. Utilities are an allowable payment. Tenancy deposit is an allowable payment, but as I've said, there's now laws around that it has to be 5 weeks maximum. A holding deposit is an allowable payment, but there's a load of rules around that, which I'm going to talk to you about shortly. And there are also some default fees that you as a landlord or we as an agent can charge a tenant, but not very many. So if we move on.
Can you pay 6 months up front?
They can still pay 6 months rent in advance, absolutely, because that's not a higher rent in month one. There's no restrictions on that at all. Now, again, I'm going to go on to a few more permitted payments. Green Deal is a permitted payment. Now, Green Deal's relative because of the EPC changes that we're going to talk about in a little while. So that is allowed. Early termination is also a permitted payment that they have allowed within the guidance. So, for example, if you rent a property to somebody on a 12-month basis and they then want to move out within 3 months, the guidance now states that you shouldn't reasonably withhold agreement to that, but you shouldn't necessarily be at a loss, okay? Because they're contractually bound to pay you that money. So you are able to charge rent until a new tenant is found up to the duration of the end of the tenancy. But bear in mind, if you are agreeing with them that I'm charging you rent until a new tenant is found, you should be marketing the property, okay? You should be actively trying to find a new tenant. And if you use an agent for the purpose of renting your properties out, then they can also be billed for your setup fees. Because those that do use agents know we charge you a setup fee every time we find you a tenant. There's a lot of work that has to go into that. The tenant can be charged that cost for you. It has to be reasonable agent charges. The rent, there's no reasonable, it's for the duration of the contract or until a new tenant's found. But the cost for the agent part of it needs to be reasonable. So again, let's use the example. Tenant moves in on a 12-month contract. They want to move out on month 10. It wouldn't necessarily be reasonable for you to offload all of your letting agent charges to that tenant. Because in 2 months, if they fulfilled that contract and left, you would have to pay that fee again anyway to find a new tenant. But it is reasonable to say that they should pay an apportionment of that cost because it's a cost that you've incurred sooner than you would have needed to. Does that make sense, yeah? Wonderful. Okay, there's also a few other things that we can charge for. If your tenant wants to change the contract for whatever reason throughout the tenancy, so there's a contract in place and they want to add a tenant. They want permission to decorate and that needs to go into the tenancy. They want to add a pet and you allow them to and there needs to be a change to the contract. You can charge for that, but it's capped at no more than £50, including VAT, okay? And that's for agents and landlords. So any changes to the contract that is a request from the tenant can be chargeable to the tenant. There's deposit replacement schemes that are available, and I'm going to talk to you about that in more detail shortly. They are allowed only if you give the tenant an option, okay? What I'm saying is you can't say, I am marketing this property and I insist you take out a deposit replacement scheme. Because a deposit replacement scheme is at a cost to the tenant. What you can say is, I'm marketing this property and I would like either a 5-week cash deposit or the deposit replacement scheme. You can specify that you don't want a deposit scheme and you only want a 5-week deposit because that's a permitted payment in the legislation. But the other way around you can't do. And any insurances now you must make sure are optional. For many years in our contract we've insisted or we've tried to insist and enforce that tenants have liability cover to protect you as landlords for their responsibility within your property. We can't enforce that anymore. It has to be optional. So you can't say to your tenant, I'll rent this property to you And you must have contents insurance. You can't do that. They've been ever so kind and they've allowed us to charge tenants fees for rent arrears. Now, this is one of the concerning things for me. Not because of making money, but there's now no red herring in terms of tenants paying. There's nothing we can use, really, to get them to pay their rent now. The rent arrears are capped. You can charge a fee, but the fee that you can charge is capped at 3% above base rate. At the moment, base rate is 0.75. You can charge 3.75% of the rent for the days that they're in arrears. Now, I'm going to just give you a very quick... Now, don't write this calculation down because it's not exactly right. But on a rent of around $550, the fee that you can charge them is £2.40 if they're a month in arrears. Now, from an agency point of view, administratively, that's not worth it. From a landlord point of view, I don't think it will be worth it for you guys. You've got to worry about calculating it, making sure you're not taking too much. And those charges only kick in when a tenant's 14 days or more in arrears. So whereas our process at the moment is we write to them on day 7, day 14 we're billing you a letter fee, day 21 we're billing you another letter fee. And the reason we do that is to encourage them to make payment. It's not to make money because we don't make money off letter fees, but it's to encourage them. If you don't make your payment within the next couple of days, you will be having a default fee put in on your account. So that does concern me slightly about tenants and their ability to pay on time. Because now as well, if a tenant, let's say their rent's due on the 20th of the month, but they get paid on the 1st of the month, at the moment what we'd say to them is you need to pay the difference to change your standing order so that your rent becomes due on the 1st. Well, now they'll just say, don't matter, I've got 14 days to pay it late, haven't I? Before you can do anything. So you see, this does concern me slightly, but they have allowed it. Cost of keys, this was another big one, particularly for agent, because they were saying that agents can't charge for their time. There was also talk about we couldn't charge them for a locksmith, which I just thought was bizarre. You could only charge them for the cost of a key. You can now charge them if a locksmith is required for the locksmith bill. However, if you are providing your tenant with let's say the tenant's lost their keys and you're a lovely landlord and you have a spare one and you're prepared to just let me have a copy, or you're going to get a copy cut for me, you can only charge me what that key cost you. Can't charge me for your time, you can't charge me any extra. If it costs you £5.24, that's what you have to bill me. And for agents, they can now only bill for a maximum of £15 per hour for their time, but have to be able to prove it. But what this is going to do, guys, like in realistic terms, is if tenants lose their keys, landlords and agents are just going to say, well, that's your responsibility, get a locksmith out and sort it out. A lot of this piece of legislation has actually worked in the way that they didn't want it to, because it's actually making things worse for tenants, because higher rents mean that they're paying more money for a longer time. Landlords may be less inclined to be as helpful as they might have been before when they were getting some sort of value, cost out of it. But the one thing I'm going to say to you is, you don't have terms of business as private landlords, I'm presuming, but you do have tenancy agreements, I'm hoping, with your tenants. In order to charge any of the fees that I've talked about today, the clauses must be in your tenancy agreement. If they are not in your tenancy agreement, everything I've talked to you about today cannot be charged in terms of the default payments. Does that make sense, guys?